Gracias, buenos dias. Thank you so much for the introduction. Please forgive my non-speaking of Spanish. I hope that the information will be conveyed in a quality way, even though it gets translated from one language to another. I was very honored to be invited to come speak at this conference, although somewhat looked at the opportunity to kind of say the people that I usually talk to are business people who are frequently looking to understand how to make best use of their data. Here I have the opportunity to speak to people who actually may understand what I'm talking about somewhat, because you understand the value of information and how it's being used. But I will admit that a lot of the material that I talk about is often focused on a business environment, and that's when I discuss this with the organizing folks. They said that's completely of interest to people here. So hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to afterwards, if not after the talk today, maybe sometime during the day, to chat about some of these ideas as well. But I did want to start out with a story that I was told a very long time ago, and actually I since have learned that it's actually not true. But do you recognize this car? This is a car that was introduced in the 1960s by Chevrolet, and it's called the Chevrolet Nova. And my friends had told me that the car did not sell well in Mexico and Latin American countries because of the name Nova, that it didn't go. So what we learned from this, and now, like I said, I have learned since that this is not actually true, but that there was an issue with selling the car, but it does convey the concept that what we understand is based on where we are in the context of where we're understanding that information. And so if we do look at the structure and the elements and the values of the data, that definitely differs from what we comprehend and what we understand when we actually look at that information. And so sometimes there's ambiguity, there's differences in understanding what something actually means. And when that happens, that leads to inconsistency and confusion and ultimately negative impacts. Now, in business environments, this can lead to some significant business impacts. So we're going to look at some examples coming up. But the first question I want to raise is how do we measure information quality? What does information quality really mean? And to some extent, anytime you want to be able to measure something, you need to have something that's quantifiable, something that you can actually count. And this goes back to those of you who are familiar with Lord Kelvin, who was a late 19th century scientist and chemist and physicist, who said, basically, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. If there's anything that you want to be able to improve, you need to be able to have some key methods of measurement so that you can say, here's where we are today, here's where we want to be, and then understand how to get from where we are today to where we want to be. But the question is, how do you measure the quality of information? What does the quality of information really mean? And I can share with you what 20 or 30 years worth of research in the data quality space, and I'll differentiate between data quality and information quality, because I think the very subtle difference is extremely important. In the data quality world, they talk about fitness for use. And that is understanding that if we have a database, or if we have a data management system, or a transaction system, that the usability of that data is relevant to how the people using that data really look at it. And this reflects what Dr. Rodriguez said before, which is that it's not to say that it's good or bad, but rather it's suitable for my particular use. And when we look at measuring the quality of data in the data quality world, we talk about dimensions of data quality and focusing on the values themselves, whether it's the accuracy of the data value, or the completeness of a record, or consistency of data values or data records between two different data sets, or the currency, how up to date the data is, and whether you can audit the quality of that information using real measures. But these are somewhat out of date in our world today because we're not only focused on data that's sitting in databases and records that are coming into files, but rather we have massive data volumes that are being created on a daily basis, moment by moment. We have a broad variety of the different types of data that's being created. And the understanding of what that data means just gets more and more diverse. It gets more difficult to understand what people are talking about. So if you look at, in today's world, we've got all sorts of information that's being created and thrown out into the World Wide Web, into the internet, into being stored. And we're going to look at some of those scales. For example, and I have some references here, and if, like, afterwards I can share with you where these references came from. First is structured data volume growth, where we're looking at data that's being created for transaction systems or operational systems that are collecting data into structured records, where we have a particular set of data attributes and values that are associated with those attributes and records. And I'm sure you're very familiar with that type of data. As of April 2012, the compound annual growth rate of structured data is 20% per year, which means that structured data is doubling every 3 to 4 years, the amount of structured data that exists. Unstructured data, I think, is much more of an issue. The data that is being put out in articles and blogs and images and videos. This is growing, again, here's another quote. In 2011, the amount of information created and replicated will surpass 1.8 zettabytes. And zettabyte is, I think, a million gigabytes, or maybe another order of magnitude. It's beyond comprehension. And it's going to grow by a factor of 9 in just 5 years. So they're looking to have 20, 30, 40 zettabytes. These are names of numbers that I never heard before. And by 2016, the annual global traffic over the internet is forecast to be 1.3 zettabytes. So again, large amounts of data being pushed all over the place in different environments. And the percentage of unstructured data of all of that information over the next 5 years, enterprise data will grow by 800%, with 80% of that data being unstructured. So if you look at any kind of environment, the more they're creating more and more information, and more of it is increasingly unstructured. So we have the different types of challenges when it comes to data quality and information quality as well. We can look at the real challenge here, which is we have different sources of information, and we have different ways of combining that information. So you can look at the fact that you've got many different news agencies that are writing articles and columns and news items. You've got all sorts of individuals who are posting their own opinions all over the place in their different web blogs and different contexts as well. You've got search. You've got all sorts of different documents that are being subjected to indexing and being put into Google and other types of search engines, which need to be aggregated and collected and collated and reviewed based on the concepts that are in there, not necessarily the data items themselves. But we also have limited patience for waiting for a response. So we've got data coming from all sorts of different places. Twitter is are you familiar with Twitter? Twitter is a particularly interesting source of information because you're able to combine concepts based on the traffic, but the amount of traffic is limited to very small bursts. So people try to combine a lot of content into very small amounts, or a lot of concepts into very small amount of content. But there's a lot of it. And so again, very difficult challenge in trying to collect all that and be able to make sense of that. And that's really what I think the point of this is, that we have little control over the data and where it comes from, but we want to be able to make sense of it fairly rapidly, so that if there is an opportunity to take some action on that, we can do it in a reasonable time frame. Now, what that means is that our ability to absorb lots of information has to be condensed into identifying the small bits and pieces of gold that exist in this broad amount of data, and turn that into reasonable and high quality information. And I can give some examples of where the ambiguity or the difference in the variance in definitions and semantics really starts to creep into being a business problem. And here's one quick example. The same things can mean have different meanings in different contexts. And when we're only operating in our own siloed context, or we operate with just looking at the things that we're looking at, it's completely makes sense. But if we start combining data from across my area and your area and your area, and we start to try to understand what that really means, we get the small subtle variances start to create large differences. And so an example here is we want to count how many people work for a company. How many employees does a company have? Well, the definition of employee differs depending on who's using it. So for example, we might say that employee hire date might be the date that the candidate was offered a job. It's a candidate hire date, or employee hire date. Or it might be the date that the candidate accepted the job. Or it might be the date that the employee first started working at the company. Or it might be the date that that an employee who used to work for the company, who left the company, now came back to the company. Which is the employee hire date? Is it the first date or is it the second date? Does that employee have two hire dates? But we want to start looking at aggregating the amount of employees that we have over a certain time frame. We need to have a clear definition of what those things mean, or what those words mean. But any selected definition changes the meanings of those other uses. So if we're looking in the benefits department and we want to cover health insurance, and that's covered as of the first day that the employee comes to work, that's not the same as the date that the employee accepted the offer. And so from a true business perspective, there's actually a very different definition of what those things mean. Another example, we all have acted in the role of customer with respect to doing business with other companies, correct? And we all understand what a customer means, of course. Well, I said that at a meeting once, and I was surprised, or actually I was not really surprised, that the person who worked in the sales department said the customer is a person who pays us for our products or our services. But it turns out that there was somebody else sitting in that meeting, and that was the person who works for the customer support center. And that person said, we often will give trial versions of our products to potential customers so that they can try it out to see whether they like what they see. And when we provide that product or that service, they often get customer support. So from our perspective, a customer is anybody who gets support for our products or services. Now those are two different sets of people. Now some of the people who have paid for the products are also going to be people who have gotten a temporary license or a temporary version of the product. But if we want to then say how many customers does the company have, when we add them all up, we'll end up with two different numbers. And so what this just goes to show is that the representations and the underlying meanings for these potentially different definitions may have a conflict. And we really want to understand what are the business terms that we're using, where their definitions come from, who gave that definition, is that an authoritative definition, and then being able to use those definitions to really organize our thoughts around what those things mean, whether it comes from one particular context or another different context, and whether those concepts really mean the same thing, in which case we can use them together, or whether they don't mean the same thing, in which case we can't use them together. So we want to be able to resolve ambiguity into a single representation when we can, but we want to differentiate two different uses of the same words when they have two different meanings. And this is very important in a lot of environments where decision making is going on all the time based on understanding the meanings of the information that's being presented. So in an organization, you may have people who are the senior managers of the company are making strategic decisions about where the company will go and what types of businesses they'll acquire and what types of products the company is going to make. These are very broad and visionary decisions, while you have at the same time, people at the very lowest level of organization who are working in an operational environment or making decisions on a moment-by-moment basis, such as in the customer support center when you call to complain about whether your cell phone is working, whether they'll offer you a free month worth of service or they will offer you a new telephone. They're making decisions that are operational or transactional on a moment-by-moment basis, as opposed to those broad visionary decisions that are being made at the top level. Decisions are being made all up and down the management chain, and they're all being made based on the information that's being presented to them and the quality of that information within the context of their own use. And so what we really want to be able to understand is how can we use the definitions and the semantics to organize the presentation of that information in a way that is suitable for the particular use of the particular individuals within the organization. And again, we can look at another example. When you, let's say you go to an online website like an Amazon or a department store that has an online store, and you order a product, from the time that you enter your data to the time that the product is delivered to your home, there's a lot of information that needs to be shared, exchanged, and ensured that the quality of that information is high to make sure that it happens in the right place. So it means that from the point that the order is taken to the point where it's looked to see whether the product is in stock in the warehouse, to whether it can be put into a box and then put into a truck and then have the truck be able to deliver that item directly to the right location. This is all a question of having high quality information. We have to look at what information is relevant at each point, because the information that's relevant over here, which is the location of where the item is to be delivered, that's the most important piece at that point. But when you're the salesperson, the most important piece is being able to understand who you're selling to and how they're going to pay. So collecting the information here, this individual may be more focused on the payment, but less about the delivery location. But what we need to be able to do is understand that what is necessary here, what's necessary at this point, at every single point along the line, and be able to fold that into the process to ensure that when the data is collected at the entry point, all the information that's necessary is collected, and the quality of that information is validated with respect to how it's being used by everybody else down the road. And that gives us a little bit more of a context to focus on understanding the relevance of quality information to the way an organization runs. Now, I often discuss this in the context of running a business, and there are different aspects that the business really focuses on. We always look at these 5 areas, starting from revenue, which is being able to make sales or generate income, risk, being able to manage risks associated with the way the business is running, or in fact things like regulatory compliance or observance of standards within the industry. The customer experience, that's how the customer perceives the way they do business or interact with the organization. The performance of the organization, are the people productive? Are we creating the right products? Are they being done in an efficient manner? And then managing expenses. Are we paying a lot for our raw materials? Are we not negotiating well with our vendors? And so in each one of these environments, everything that an organization deals with pretty much will be organized into one of these high-level categories. So whether it's risk, or whether it's generating revenue, or whether it's managing expenses, I can't imagine that there's anybody in this room who doesn't work for an organization that needs to manage optimal allocations of resources in order to benefit one or more of these categories. The question is, what's the relationship between these value drivers and the use of information, and how does that translate into the way that we do our business, and the way we put our processes together, and the way that we build our operational or transaction information systems. And unfortunately, I will say this from experience, most of the time these questions are not asked until long after the systems have been built and don't work. And that becomes a little bit of a challenge, because people will go out and try to solve a problem by buying technology developing a system without understanding that it's not the system that's relevant, it's how the people use the information that's generated by that system that's relevant, because they're making their decisions based on how that system presents that information. And so we have to go back to Lord Kelvin and talk about measuring the quality of that information, and being able to look at how do we put a quantifiable measure to be able to get a metric that's relevant with respect to how people are using that data. And so what we've done is we've focused on these 5 aspects of business value: again, revenue, managing expenses, reducing risk, improving performance, and enhancing the customer experience. And really what we want to do is come up with the connectivity between these value drivers and the use of information by the people who are the key within those processes. And then identify some measures, assess where the gaps are, identify opportunities for improvement, and then adjust our processes, not just create a new system, but adjust the processes so that we can then determine whether the improvement in information utility and usability actually improves our corresponding value driver. So if we are not able to sell a lot of our products to our customers, the question then becomes, what information do we need to be able to improve the way that we sell those products to our customers? And then if we can improve that information and the process by which people use that information, does that correspond to an increase in sales? And that's really looking at how we cast the utilization of the data and information in a business environment. So in order to do this, we can't let those questions that we talked about before remain unasked. We have to actually go to the consumers of information and say, what is it that you need? What information are you looking for? And not just say, give me a list of data elements or data items, but say, explain to me how you do what you do. And what do you define success in your processes? And then how is information used? And then what are the gaps in the use of that information? Where are the problems in the data that can be identified that we can then work back and figure out how to improve the quality of that information so that it can be, that can lead to business improvement. So those are the kinds of questions that we're going to start asking. What are the measures that are used in measuring successful performance? What are the different attributes that are necessary for attribution? Is it location? Is it time? Is it information about individuals? Is it information about products? Is it information about assets? Is it information about a catalog of items that we manage? Where are those things being managed? How often do they need to be reviewed? How often do they need to be updated? Those types of questions. What are the key business terms that are being used? And I think this is where we start to get some real interesting challenges that have not really been addressed by the information technology people. And this is why I accepted the opportunity to come speak here, because I think these kinds of questions are the ones that people who deal with information all the time have a good sense of skill and expertise to be able to help, so we can bridge that gap between the information technology and the information users. So these are things like, what are the key business terms that are being used, and how are those terms defined, and how many different ways are those terms being defined, and what are the differences in those definitions, and how are our performance measures reviewed, and what are the processes in place that take advantage of those performance reviews. And ultimately, how do I look at the use of information and for performance measures, and then fold that back into the criteria for managing high quality information when the data is being created in the first place. So what's the relationship between the use of information and the ultimate desired business improvements? And here it's really looking at making that connection between the improvements in value and the underlying pieces of data. So here it's looking at reducing risk and increasing revenues, or improving the customer experience, or improving productivity and performance, or increasing or reducing costs. We want to, number one, come up with some key measures of what is meant by information usability and information quality, get some baseline measures, see what the opportunities are, and those opportunities are not just technology opportunities, but rather, given the improvement in the technology, what's the better way that people can do things? And then, how can we get that benefit out of that? What's the probability of getting that benefit? What's the cost of doing these improvements? And then weighing those in the difference. Does the value that we get from making the improvements override the cost of making the improvements? In some places, it doesn't. Sometimes it costs more to make improvements than the value that you get out of it. And so you have to be able to have that measure that says, what's the line of sight from business value drivers to the use of information, identify the opportunities, and then focus on the usability of that data wherever it comes from, whether it's structured data coming from databases stored over decades of years of storage, or whether it's newly created data coming from unstructured sources, including images and photographs and articles and documents and videos, etc., Twitter, Facebook, all these different sources of data, and being able to say, is there something that we can measure about the quality of that information that can feed into a particular improvement in the way we do business? And so that allows us to continue to drill down into how information is being used. And this is an image that I've used in a number of different places that really focuses on the lineage of the use of information. Start with a business term. And that business term, like customer, or employee, or birth date, or identification number, or driver's license number, might have different uses and with different meanings. And so we might map that out to say, well, there's one use with one particular definition, then show that there's a data element concept that is used in different data sets. So here's an example where we might have a birth date data element that is stored in one data set with a particular data type, and I have a similar concept that's being used in a different database with a different name, DOB, for date of birth. So I have birth date in one, date of birth in another, different sizes, different types of those data elements, but conceptually they mean the same thing because they're being used in the same definition. Now we'll see that we have date of birth being used for a different definition, and in that case, we would see it being mapped in a different environment. But being able to collect all this metadata about the use of data is a relatively big challenge. What we want to do is identify the variance in those meanings, be able to track down where the uses are so that we can determine whether those meanings can be resolved or not, or need to be differentiated when we're trying to make some sense of much more information. So that focuses on being able to manage the metadata. So an example would be a business term glossary. So we've got the term customer. We've got 5 different definitions for customer. We've got the term employee. We've got the term date of birth. And we've got a concept of date of birth. And really what we're looking at is what's the term, what its use, what's the definition, the calendar date on which the customer was born. And in that pure sense is being used in its different data sets. And then we can collect all these definitions into a shared repository so that all of us who understand and work with these terms can suddenly start differentiating between the use of date of birth in one context and a birth date that's being used for a different context. Okay, so as an example, I have another example in a couple minutes. But what this has started to evolve is an aspect of what we call data governance, which is creating new opportunities for people with experience in semantics, taxonomies, in organization of knowledge hierarchies to collect that information and manage it collectively in a collaborative environment that allows us to not just say, here's a definition of customer, but rather I can present my definition of customer and everybody else who cares about the term customer can present their definition of customer. And we can start organizing taxonomies and hierarchies of those definitions to see where there's overlap and where they actually mean the same thing and when they don't. And as we start looking at where the lineage is and where those are being used, we see how and when a business term or a definition or a conceptual data domains where we have an enumeration or a list of different types of concepts. A good example is the list of countries in the world. That's a conceptual domain. But we have different value domains that have a different representation for each one of those countries. So a country may have a country name, which is a fully spelled out name. It could be spelled out in one language or another, so we have English, perhaps English names of countries, as opposed to the country names that are spelled out in both the language and the alphabet of the people who live there. So that you can have a location called Mexico City, but they may also be called Ciudad de Mexico. Is that correct? And those are two different names, but they refer to the same thing. So we can have the same concepts and a list of those concepts, and we have multiple representations of those concepts. Those would be value domains. And then we can have data element concepts like a country itself would refer to some value that's taken from one of those conceptual domains. And I can represent that as a data element in a particular data set, which is a character string that has 25 characters that's sufficient to store one of the representations that is used for the conceptual domain. Now, it's because for something like country, I can have it stored out as a character string, but I can also have a country code. I can have a 3-digit country code. I can have a 2-digit country code. I can have a 3-character country code, a 2-character country code. For example, if you look at websites that the web suffix .ms or .uk, those are 2-character country codes that differentiate the different concepts that are associated with the source of those web addresses. And that is a piece of information that maps to what is actually a data element. It's a 2-character code, which is representative of the data element concept, which is the country of origin for the website, which then maps back to a value domain associated with a conceptual domain, which is the 2-character representations of countries. So you see, what we're starting to look at is where is there information that we can characterize and describe, and what's the difference between that and the different types of words that show up in documents or items that can be identified in an image, or words that are coming in an audio stream that don't really carry some meaning and definition, and when are those relevant, when are they not, and then make a network or communication with the other people in your environment who really care about those particular pieces of information. So that gives you the opportunity to say, who cares about that particular use of the 2-character country code? Because it may be used in the web address, but it might also be used in currency transactions to determine whether the currency code is correct for the particular geographic location. And that gives us this framework or environment for sharing knowledge and sharing information about the use of business terms and business terms in the glossary, so that we can start making sense of these massive volumes of data. Now, when we get these massive volumes of data, we can start scanning through that and organizing it based on the knowledge base of this metadata. So that when we look at a Twitter posting, which has a bunch of embedded tags that are preceded by a hash sign or a pound sign, that we can say, well, Obama is referring to the President of the United States, and so their content in this message may be relevant to politics or the American president. So that's a good example of where you're starting to look at not just the data itself, but how it's being used and what its contextual meaning is. And that the more you see these different strings that are being embedded in messages or in tweets or in Facebook postings or in blogs or in articles, you can start getting an understanding of how you organize and index that information, not just by the character string, but by the content, by the concept itself. And this we start to see in search engines, for example, where you can go to a Google and you can start typing something in, and it'll start giving you suggestions of other things that you might want to complete, because it knows that once it recognizes that one concept, that here are some other concepts that are relevant associated with that single concept. Or if you spell something incorrectly, that you might see that from the context and understanding the concepts, that the misspelling actually has an underlying meaning that's equivalent to something that was spelled in the correct way. And so that's how we start organizing that information in a way based on not just on the structure of the data value itself, but the underlying meaning that can be ascribed or given to those items. And that gives us an opportunity to do what we call harmonization, which is to be able to take two different values and assign them essentially the same meaning and to determine when they actually mean the same thing. So here we have an example of the term that we used before, date of birth, which is used as a date and time stamp associated with the calendar date on which the customer was born. But in fact, sometimes we don't use the date of birth for understanding how old an individual is. Sometimes we use it for authentication. So I've had this experience where I will call my cell phone operator and they will say, we need to make sure that you're who you say you are. So what is your date of birth? So I'll give them my date of birth and they'll see that it matches what they have in their data set, and that is one method of determining that I am who I am. So in this case, the context of the date of birth value is actually being used for a different purpose. And I want to be able to differentiate between the use of the concept and its actual definitions. So here, that gives us a chance to say, well, people who are working in customer service use date of birth for authentication, while people in sales use it to verify that that the customer is old enough to make transactions on behalf of an account, that they're 18 years or older, and can actually are old enough to transact on behalf of a particular account. Now, the harmonization process will look at those and say, well, the structure may be the same, but the meanings are different. So we actually have to differentiate between those two. And that gives us a little bit more of a benefit when we change our rules. So here's the situation. We determined that we were using date of birth for authentication, but it's very easy to find out somebody's date of birth. So it's no longer a good data element to use for authentication because somebody else might find out my date of birth and call the company and use my date of birth and falsely authenticate. So now they say, well, you need to have a personal identification number or a PIN that's some kind of identifier that's used for authentication that only you would know. It's like a password. And that's a unique number that might be assigned by the company to you that says when you call, use this number to verify that you are who you say you are. So what that says is when we're changing the rules about how you do authentication, I need to find all the places where I'm doing authentication and what data elements I'm using and change them, which means that if I was using date of birth, I have to find data where everybody's using date of birth for authentication and then change it. So if you look here, they're both using date of birth, but now this other person has to use his customer PIN to be able to do authentication while the first person continues to use date of birth to validate new customers to see that they can that they're allowed to make transactions and that they can pay for those transactions. Now the other thing that I want to talk about with respect to the quality of the use of information has to do with going back to what I talked about in the search environment, which is organizing terms by their underlying meanings, because we can start seeing that people use different words, but they mean the same thing. So an example that I often use is that I have an automobile and I have a car. Those two refer to the same concept. But I also can talk about an SUV, a sports utility vehicle, or I can talk about a minivan, or I can talk about a truck, and those are also vehicles. They're also some type of vehicle. So when I am using those terms in a content, in a document, I need to differentiate and determine where the use of an SUV is being used to distinguish it from a minivan, and when it's irrelevant, when they're both talking about mileage or fuel efficiency with respect to an automobile as opposed to how many seats are in the car. And so I started using our semantic metadata to build up taxonomies and hierarchies. So an example here is office supplies. And I used this example when we were talking to a company that was trying to do what they call spend management and spend analysis to see who was selling them office supplies and whether they were paying different amounts to different companies for the same thing. So they didn't know because one company called it a standard clip, and one called it a metal standard clip, and one called it a colored standard clip, but they're both standard clips. But they're also buying butterfly clips and binder clips and specialty clips that are all correspond to this concept of clips. And what they want to start doing is saying, who's selling us clips, and what is the price of clips? And if they're calling them paper clips while somebody else is just calling them a clip, I also need to know that those things mean the same thing, and that they all roll up into the same hierarchy. And the same thing for paper, same thing for telephone supplies, same thing for ink, etc. These types of things. And these are, when you're a small company, it's not so relevant. When you're a company with 50,000 people, each one of them is using paper clips and paper and ink and toner and all sorts of different office supplies on a day-to-day basis. Pens, pencils. You want to know whether you can get a difference of $1 or $2 dollars in a case of paper clips, because if there's an economy of scale, and that will save you lots and lots of money. But if you don't know what those things are, you can't do that analysis. So that's just another example of how the underlying information is relevant outside of the actual representation of the value for that. So, the reason that I wanted to talk about this is that people who work with organizing information are the types of people who have the skills and expertise that's really critical for being able to make sense out of these massive volumes of data as we go forward in the world, with more and more data being pushed out, big data, lots of different types of data, lots of different variety. It's people who have the skills and expertise in organization of information that are going to lend their expertise to be able to make this actually work. What that says is can we do some cross-fertilization between different areas of people with different types of expertise to help merge those ideas together to change process? Are there practices and disciplines and trainings to ensure socialization and integration of the semantic organization of data to improve the quality? Is there governance? Is there an organization that can oversee that activity and ensure the definition of data policies and information usage policies, and then as well as making sure that those are being complied with? Comprehensiveness. Do we have the tools and techniques to capture all that information, and we have the right resources to make sure that we can maintain that information? Because every day there's going to be a new definition for customer, a new definition for paper clips. And so we have to continually keep that up to date. Is it easy to use? Because if we create systems that are not easy to use, they're going to be ignored and just lend more towards confusion and inconsistency and ambiguity. Maintenance. Is the organization willing to continue to invest in the maintenance of that asset, or maintaining that collaborative metadata that has understanding of that meaning? And then the last question, which I put in bold, is expertise. Have we engaged with the right people with the right level of skills and experience to drive the successful accomplishment of this process? So with that, I think we have some time. I think we talked about having some time for questions if anybody had any questions. And otherwise, again, I want to thank the organizing committee and the university for inviting me to come speak at this conference.